Welcome to The Spoken Nerd, the podcast about database technology. I'm your host, Connor McDonald, and in this episode, I'll continue chatting to good friend Martin Bach. In the first episode, we covered our common history of working in the UK and how we both got into IT. In this episode, we explore our use of social media as a way of getting information to the community and also talk about Martin's time at Encatech, an organisation that was widely known as having the smartest Oracle people in the room. Enjoy. One thing I noticed in terms of timeline is the birth of Martin Bach Consulting seemed to coincide with the birth of your blog. Not that it's easy to go tracking through the history of your blog. There's no calendar, there's no timeline on it. So I had to go digging through. I had to press next 1,000 times to get back to 2009, first post being purging of the shared pool, purging a cursor from the shared pool. What was your motivation for getting into blogging?
Actually, I did have a blog as early as 2004, but I've taken that off the internet because of data protection regulations, where I was self-hosting and I didn't want to get into that whole malarkey of getting people's consent and everything. But that was based on some content management software, and it was also a pain to maintain, and formatting was limited. Blogging, I mean, the whole community thing, that started quite early for me. I signed up for my first job, so I fresh graduates from university, knows nothing, thinks otherwise, gets the shock of the real world. And so, but what the first week my boss said to me, hey, we signed you up for this organization called DOAG. So this is the German Oracle user group at the time. They renamed it quite recently, but at the time that was the local Oracle user group community. And I thought, yeah, well, if you pay for it, if you sign that up, that's okay. I'll go maybe once every quarter. We had meetups and we would stay after work, talk about, somebody would do a presentation and talk about some interesting things they had encountered in their day jobs. And afterwards we'd go for a meal. That sounds okay. I got started with that. And I think my first talk was in 2004, and I talked about partitioning. And looking back at those slides, I found them recently. I thought, well, there's perhaps more to be said to partitioning than I did say at the time. But it was a good learning experience, because if you think you understand something, that's one thing. But when you get to the next step is explaining how a certain thing works, then you kind of realize that maybe your understanding isn't quite as complete as you thought. So I started blogging about various things at that time, but my blog didn't have a lot of reach because it was self-hosted, and self-hosted was troublesome at the time. But everyone was on this new platform called WordPress, and WordPress had good search engine optimization. And whenever you search for something on the websites, something WordPress.com would turn up, and I thought, hey, this is a great thing. I want to do the same thing. Actually, it coincides with the release of 11.2. This is when I thought, there's a new release that comes out, and people are going to be clamoring for information. They'll be kind of hanging on your lips, so to say. And that'll be the time when I'm going to publish posts about 11.2, and that's what I did.
You'll go viral, you'll explode.
Oh yeah, well, that didn't quite happen that way. It's things that I think are useful, but it's not kind of mainstream. I don't want to blog about, I don't want to have the 10th post about something that people have already covered. So whenever I blog, it's hard because I want to have something that adds value for people that hasn't been covered already.
I take a lot of comfort from your comments about German User Group. I had a similar experience when I was in the UK, and I was actually getting ready maybe to think about heading home to Australia. My wife and I were thinking about having children. We didn't end up going at that particular time, but I thought I should probably maybe get involved in the UK User Group. I'd met a few people at the UK conference. They said get involved in the SIGs, as they call them, the special interest groups. I did a talk there on, I can't even remember what it was on. I'm sure I pretty much gave it poorly, but the follow-up person was a guy named Jonathan Lewis, who was giving a talk and also spruiking one of his classes, get himself some more revenue. And I thought, I'll be going home to Australia soon. I may as well sign up to that. And ended up sitting in this class next to someone named Mogens Norgard. And if you ever wanted to get an idea of the importance of community, that's obviously the man for it. But it's funny how it is those simple things like being involved in a user group, like we see in terms of having those, college professors, that they can be such great things in terms of shaping the way you understand the product and also understand your own shortcomings. You mentioned finding some of your old presentations. I found some old hard copies of presentations I've given. I don't have them in software anymore, but some old hard copies when I was digging around some old boxes. And I remember, like, one of the first slides is why you need to rebuild your indexes every night. I'm just looking at it going, oh my goodness, yeah. Not only does it worry me that was my line of thinking, the fact that I obviously gave this presentation to a whole bunch of other people telling them that this should be their line of thinking as well, but not to worry. That first blog post I found from 2009 was referring to some information on the Oracle-L list, which it's still going today. That's 15 years on. Perhaps not as strong as it used to be. Given the way the world is now in terms of, you think like Stack Overflow and ChatGPT, etc., do you think there's room still for these sort of chat room style forum kind of platforms, or has the world moved to sort of less interaction between people in the community, more just like things like blog content? People want static information to get their answers. Or do you think there's still a future for things like Oracle-L and typical tech forums?
I've been pretty much involved with the 23 free database forum, and I think we had a fair bit of changes with the community over there. So I think there is definitely a place for those. Just the tools and the media that we use these days, they are different. When I started out, there was the Usenet was a thing. That's a long time ago now. But the Usenet had, hierarchical groups where people would just hang out and chat about interesting things they had encountered. And Oracle-L is kind of in the same vein. For me, this has been incredibly useful source of information. I subscribe to the digest that you get like once a week, I think it was, because the volume of traffic was pretty high. So that was a little distracting at the time. But there were lots, all these people, like you were saying, Julian Dyke was on there, Alexander Fettkulin, Fritz Hochland, lots of other people who are knew their stuff. So if you had an interesting problem, you could post it there, even though you weren't at a community event where you could just, talk to somebody in person. And that would cross the time zones, and everyone subscribed to that. They would see the question. And at the time, I haven't looked at it for a while, but at the time, there were lots of really, really, really good answers. Tanel was on there, I just remember. And lots and lots and lots of good content, and doesn't show up on search results nowadays. They don't rank high enough to pop up on page 1 or 2, but at the time, to me, that was quite a good source of information. Forums, I guess, have taken over, vendor forums mainly for this kind of thing, but I guess it's getting a little less used. There are other things that challenge these formats, like there are Slack groups and channels where people hang out to discuss technology. Yeah, I guess we'll have to see what the time brings, but I'm a great fan and I benefited a lot from those.
In fact, this one needs a one-word answer. Slack, good or bad?
Maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I have some interesting similar thoughts on things like chat rooms and forums and Slack. It's funny how Stack Overflow seemed to take over the world in terms of that kind of presence. But even now, when I jump onto Stack Overflow, obviously in the Oracle side of things, you don't see a lot of volume because we do have our own set of vendor forums, and people generally go there because they know they're going to get access to people who are specific expertise as Oracle. But even in the more sort of generic, the JavaScript, Java, etc., I found the volume of Stack Overflow and the sort of the frequency of posting a new question seems to have dropped off the last few years. And I do wonder if it's sort of a reflection on that people now are much more interested in, I have a problem, I need a solution, as opposed to, I want to get involved in an area with some like-minded people and have a bit of back and forth. It's the back and forth that I sort of lament to seem sort of dropped off. And that's why I'm obviously so keen to get to conferences still, because that's conferences have almost become the last bastion of actually having meaningful conversations with people. But who knows? I mean, we had a crack at the Oracle development team, Jeff Smith and the like. They had a crack at doing some stuff on Discord for a while, which seemed to go well, but I know they recently shut that down. But maybe there's a future there for that kind of chat. So, seeing as I mentioned the concept of people, I think, being that sort of shorter attention span in terms of, I just want to, here's a problem, where's a solution? I noticed that, once again, from LinkedIn stalking, you've been involved in some book writing in the past, as have I. You've been involved in a book on real application clusters, one on consolidation, which looks like it was a solo activity.
It was.
And also one on Exadata with a bunch of fellow community members. How did you find the book writing experience?
Oh, well. So after the first one, I said, I'll never do it again.
Like we all do.
Yeah, like we all do. So I mean, it was It was one of the things I always wanted to do. So back in the day, and I was heavily involved with the UK or UG, especially with the database in RAC6. So high availability and all these mission critical systems, that's always been something I wanted to be involved with. And at the time, the RAC6 was run by Julian Dyke, and he and someone else have teamed up to write the 10G version of the RAC book. When they came up and said, the publishers always want to sell books and they want to have volume. So they came back to Julian and said, hey, Julian, do you want to do a second edition of this for 11.2? And he said, yes. But he was really involved in work and, had other priorities, I guess. And he then said, well, I need someone who can help me with this. Martin, do you not want to help us? Because you've been presenting a fair bit at the user group. And so I got into that, and we decided I should do the intro, kind of what is real application clusters, why would you need it, and how kind of what's the broader picture before we get into the details of installing and running it. That was cool, and I got to learn Jonathan Gannick, who was also very, very knowledgeable. And at the time, he was the editor at the A Press where I wrote this book. And he was really the guy who helped me through, the hurdles of, getting started, getting adjusted to the process, because you just don't write stuff. You use a template they give you, and they said, we want each chapter be 30 pages. And I thought 30 pages, that's manageable, but the font size like 8 points. So, you can cover a lot of ground using a small font size. I did actually the first book that was I still marvel at how I pulled through with it. I got up in the mornings, took the train from Preston Park to London, and while I was on the train, I had my little super lightweight laptop out and I was hacking away, and I had a USB dongle with a 3G card, which gave me access to a system I had rented because the laptop wasn't powerful enough. So I was writing on the book on the way out, and then got to change trains, had to pack everything up, get out of the 12 coaches train like, everyone else, run across platform, take the next train, but that was standing room only. So I got back on the train after work, opened the laptop, but that went straight through to Preston Park. So I had like good 50 minutes of uninterrupted work, but you had to be at the train early because otherwise you couldn't sit. And then I worked on the weekends, and that became a little bit of a stress on my relation because I spent so much time on the book. But I wanted to get this finished, and in the end we did, and that was one of the moments where I thought, hey, this was pretty cool, but it was so stressful. I'll never do it again. Then a little time after, maybe a year or two later, Jonathan approached me and he said, hey, well, there's this new database version coming out, 12. Do you not want to write about it? And at the time, I've done a lot of work in the area of consolidating systems because that's what everybody was trying to do. They wanted to consolidate their systems on as few hardware platforms as possible, so as to reduce the maintenance effort. So you patch one database and essentially your system is patched, and you've now patched 42 rather than just one. And so that is when 12c came out, and I wrote about container databases and pluggable databases, how you could perhaps use them, and also how to benchmark your hardware, how to pick the best architecture, and all that sort of stuff. But that was a smaller book. So the RAC book with all of us combined, I think it's got 900 pages. This one had 300, which I still think is plenty.
Indeed, indeed.
And yeah, that's how it happened. And the third one, actually, that was when I was at Enkitech, and I got asked by Kerry, hey, can't you help us out writing this book? And that was written by Kerry Osborne himself, Randy Johnson, and Tanel Potter. And you look at these names and you think, do I really want to get involved into a rewrite of such a book?
We'll come to the Yankatech days soon. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And we did exactly. Yeah, we did complete the book. Book writing is a hard piece of work, and I'm no longer sure how much it's kind of paying off these days, because once a book is published, you can't make any changes anymore. You can of course go to the editor's website or the publisher's website and publish errata, but there's only so much you can do before you actually have to rewrite chapters, and that's just not feasible. So I thought, okay, I've done 3. That definitely is enough. Everything else I'll do on blog posts.
In fact, in my notes here, I've actually put the future for books, because I know that when we used to write books, in fact, probably still to this day, you would often be given beta access to a product, from Oracle, so you could actually have a bit of a look before the product came out. But even with that beta access, there's that classic concept of the moment you hit the publish button, your information is obsolete. And it's one of those unfortunate things where I remember Jonathan Lewis had a book from years ago, which was called Practical 8i. And he used to make a joke at conferences. He says, I've released a patch for it, which was just a little blue sticker to cover up the 8i. And it's true, mate, the vast majority of books, even books that are on detailed technology, whether it's Exadata or even multi-tenant or container databases, 90% of the book is version agnostic. It's really about concepts, good practices, how to approach something scientifically. But the public doesn't believe that. The public is always, okay, does the book have a version number on it? I need it for that version. And the moment the next version comes out, then I'll no longer need this book. So I noticed, though, that your Exadata book, the third one, has no version number on it. That was very well played. That was very an intelligent choice of title.
Well, I wish I could take it. That was the editors decided not to have the version. The editors decide on the title anyway.
It's funny you mentioned Jonathan Genick. I was in India just last week for the Global Developer Summit. I spoke there on some topics. And A-Press had a booth in the exhibition hall. And I went over there, and because it's a developer conference, there's just like a million A-Press books all laid out with Java and JavaScript and Kubernetes and microservices. And they said, oh, yeah, would you like to buy a book? And I said, no, but I've written books for you at A-Press in the past. And they said, oh, yeah, what on? And I said, oh, database technology. And they sort of looked down their noses at me, but then they said, oh, you ever heard of someone called Jonathan Genick? So obviously Jonathan is the guy that does anything to do with database technology. He's obviously the guy, but he often reaches out. Same thing, he's looking for authors, always looking for people. So I do wish A-Press all the best. I worry about the future of books because of that short attention span and the public's view that a book is always obsolete. But it is nice for someone to sit down with a tech book as opposed to sitting down with a 3-paragraph blog post, even though both you and I blog regularly.
Yeah, I think the great problem the publishing industry has is, as you say, that people aren't really into paper copies as much, and also, as you say, reading a book cover to back. I mean, that's just huge. So if I take some of what I have contributed to, that's like, as I said, 900 pages, and who has got the time to read 900 pages of tech books, even if there are screenshots of the installer and things in it. I think this is a real problem, and reading books in general, not just tech books. I guess the whole book industry is kind of challenged by all the YouTubes, TikToks, and Twitches and other platforms out there, all kind of competing for everyone's screen time.
Exactly. And in fact, I had a rather confronting episode, funnily enough, on a podcast recording. We had a intern who now works for Oracle, but I interviewed her last year sometime. It struck me as that the days of in-depth research or even just general interest in technology seem to be over. And that's why I think books are perhaps doomed in that sense, because people are not looking for expertise in a single topic. They're looking for a just enough knowledge in every topic, which I suppose is reflective of the way that applications are built nowadays. We don't use a platform, we use 37 platforms and cobble it together. But it's funny, I was talking to our intern and I said, how do you research things? How do you dig around problems? How do you solve problems while you're at your courses at college? And she said, well, for me, if I can find a 30-second TikTok or a 30-second, 2-paragraph blog post or something on Stack Overflow to solve the problem at hand so I can move on, then that's a win. And I don't want to be paraphrasing or putting words in her mouth, but that certainly seems to be a mindset now, which I'm not being critical of that. I can totally respect that the modern developer has 37 pieces of technology they have to juggle, as opposed to just knowing SQL or just knowing Peel SQL. And so the concept of being brilliant in all of them, I think, is impossible. And so now it's just like, okay, how do I write just enough CSS to get past this problem? Then how do I write just enough SQL to get the data? How do I write just enough REST wrappers to turn it into JSON? Yeah, it's always just enough to get by because the demands are so high, I suppose.
Yeah, the other thing that I think plays into this as well is the rapid rate of change, because taking it back a step, I mean, I'm incredibly fortunate that I've worked in an industry where the standard interfaces have been so stable. You learn SQL 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you still get by. I mean, there are, of course, changes to the standard that make it more versatile and make it more flexible, but the underlying principles, once you understood those, they haven't changed much. But if you develop in whatever front-end framework is popular at the moment, that front-end may still be around in 2-3 years, maybe not. Maybe there is a new version of that same front-end that shares nothing but the name. So even if you wanted to invest kind of a lot of time and effort into learning something at kind of master expert level, the chances are that your knowledge and all that effort you pour into that, they become obsolete with the next iteration or maybe the iteration after that. So can understand why you just want the solution or a good enough solution in order to move on, but it's a different world sometimes. And it's interesting, definitely.
People were tweeting recently that SQL has just turned 50. And certainly the SQL from 50 years ago, by and large, would run today without too much change. And it's funny how people are critical of that. People are like, oh, it's 50 years old, it must be garbage. But like, it's that funny thing where I would rather have a language that is mature for 50 years than, yeah, as you said, people go, oh yeah, I'm using React. They go, oh, you're using React. No, that's 2023. Yeah, now it's pumpkin scones, curly wombat. There's all these ridiculous names for frameworks and languages and stuff. And I can see the appeal. People are excited by it because I occasionally go to some of the tech subreddits on Reddit, and no one ever talks about applications they wrote. They only talk about frameworks. And it's funny, they'll find a framework that's mature and has been around and does 95% of what they need. But 95% is not enough. So it's like, I've chosen not to just work within those constraints. I've chosen to write my own framework. It's like, okay, let's see how that pans out. I shouldn't rant too much. Getting back to the book, you mentioned that last book you written was a Enkitech collaboration. I wanted to ask because I very nearly worked for Enkitech many years ago. I was speaking to Kerry about it, and Enkitech at the time, and probably even up until more recently, until they became Accenture and sort of have dissolved a little bit. But for probably a decade or more, if you were in the Oracle space, Enkitech was known as the smartest guys in the room. How did you come to be there? I'm not saying you weren't one of the smartest guys in the room, but how did you come to be at Enkitech, and what was it like, working in that group of guys and women?
That is a really good story too. I'm sometimes believe I'm a bit of a quirky guy. So you remember we talked about my time in England. So when that came to an end, I went back to EGFE where I worked before I moved to England. So I followed them, followed some of the people, what they're up to. And like I said, I liked the way how they write applications. And I thought that was stable. That's kind of, it's enterprise, so it's not super fancy, but it is very important. And I would like to be part of that again. So I got a contract, got hired, and we moved over to where we live now. So I'm still on probation period. And then 3 months in, Kerry comes, says on Twitter that they're coming to somewhere very close by. And I thought, hey, this is cool. So I'll, reply to Kerry on Twitter and say, hey, Kerry, if you're around, hey, I'd really like to meet you and maybe we can go for a beer. And he said, yeah, sure, let's meet here and there. So that was Kerry and Andy Colvin. They both were installing an Exadata in Luxembourg. And so they came over, we met. We had a nice chat and it was a bit technical and I have no clue. And then out of the blue, to me at least, Kerry said, yeah, when do you go and start work for us? And I looked at him and said, I just started a job here. I can't possibly work for you guys. And then it was really, really nice. Afterwards, I went home and in the car on the way home, I said, you stupid idiot. You just turned down Kerry's offer to work for you. Got home to the computer. Next day, emailed Kerry and said, Kerry, about that. No, I gave you yesterday. Can we still talk about that? And he said, yeah, sure. Yeah, imagine. I mean, yeah, even to this day, I thought, how could I possibly say no? This is like you playing kind of your regional league football team, and then somebody from the Champions League turns up and says, do you want to play for us? And you say, no. So how could I possibly? But yeah, so that's how I then eventually became part of Enkitech. And I have to say it was really daunting because, as you say, Kerry has been collecting. I think it's the best term of how you can describe it. Kerry has been talking to all the luminates in the industry, and those who were comfortable enough joining Enkitech, they did. And at some point, I honestly don't think there has been an equal group of really, really good people working in the same company. And that was cool. And we had an email list, which is famously called All Tech, which means it went to all the techies. And this is where people would post their problems. And they wouldn't just post, I can't start the database. I mean, that there was like tricky, intricate problems. And then, Tanel would respond and, Randy would respond, Kerry would respond, Andy, and all the other really, really good, smart people would take a large chunk of their time to respond to your problem. And nobody was ever left behind, which is something I always feared. If you become kind of the go-to guy for really tricky problems and you don't know the answer, the buck stops with you. And there was never such a moment in Enkitech because there was always somebody smarter than me who could help out. And that was just fantastic. And just like at EDBA, the Enkitech guys, they were all mega welcoming, friendly, and I'm still friends with lots of them to this day when I can come and see them.
I have to admit, in the days of Open World, now Cloud World, in San Francisco, Enkitech would occasionally have some drinks at one of the bars. And one of the things that always struck me was you walk in and everyone's talking tech and everyone's literally, their intelligence levels are off the charts. And yet they're always really humble. They're humble guys, never big upping themselves, never taking that thing of, oh, by the way, I've done this many things with this many customers, with these many Exadatas. There was always very much people happy to chat, happy to talk about their own failings as well as their successes. Yeah, it was good to see. It's funny were you there when Accenture came along, or were you gone by then?
No, no. So the I got hired to Enkitech before the acquisition, and a year after I was at Enkitech, we were required, and I stayed 8 years in total, I think. The group stayed together for a long, 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 long time. It was just when the pandemic came up, when things started to change.
And you keep your autonomy. That group sort of kept its autonomy.
Yeah, we were very fortunate to keep our autonomy, and I owe a great deal to the MD, Martin Painter, who's a good friend, and he's a super awesome guy. He shielded us from a lot of the big corporate things that he knew we were techies. We are interested in solving interesting tech problems. We are less interested in kind of what you inevitably find in larger organizations because there is a lot of process that you need to follow. And he shielded us from a lot of those things. And I'm eternally grateful for, the 8 years that I could stay there.
I remember a great quote from a presentation about management, and I apologize to whoever's listening that knows who the author of this quote is, but I don't. I don't even know what organization they came from. But they had this talk, they were saying there's two kinds of managers, and excuse my profanity. They said there's what we call a shit umbrella or a shit funnel. A good manager is a shit umbrella. They protect you from all the shit coming from above. And a bad manager is a shit funnel. The shit comes to them and they just funnel it down to you. You can always tell which side of the fence managers sit on. If we're lucky, we get the right kind of manager. But in terms of, you mentioned before about the incredibly rapid pace of IT when it came to books being obsolete. It's funny how even the smartest people in the room, I think, can get swamped by that. Like, for example, Tanel, who founded Fluent, which was a startup company that absolutely went gangbusters for a while because at that time, Hadoop was the future. Hadoop was the future of data. Everyone was talking about, yep, we're going to be big data. It's going to be Hadoop. It's going to be MapReduce. And it just shows that someone literally as smart as Tanel and Kerry, with all his entrepreneurial flair, even the smartest of us struggle with the pace of IT because the world just keeps changing. Interestingly, speaking of Hadoop, and we'll get to AI in a second because I want to talk about Oracle, I saw a tweet the other day. Someone said, if there's one thing that Hadoop taught me, it's how not to get excited about overhyped BS. So I'm ready for, and then it continued on, so I'm ready for AI. Time will tell. That brings us up to the time frame where Martin and I are now both working for Oracle. So it seems appropriate we'll talk about the next database release, 23 AI, and AI in general. We'll also talk about Martin's pet topic, JavaScript in the database, and how that might reflect some of the anti-patterns out there about where you should be running your code. And finally, we'll talk about what are some of the things we would like to change in the Oracle database if we had the chance. Hope you can join me. Thanks for listening to this podcast. The music credit goes to Zanman from Pixabay Music.